الآن لضيفة الشرف والمتحدثة الرئيسية في المؤتمر، والتي تنضم إلينا مباشرة من جوهانسبرغ عاصمة النضال في القارة الأفريقية، الأستاذة ليبوهانغ ليبوتو فيكو، وهي الناشطة وخبيرة في الاقتصاد النسوي، وأيضا مفكرة وباحثة أكاديمية في الاقتصاد السياسي، وهي أيضا مستشارة سياسات في القارة الإفريقية. لها أبحاث في الاقتصاد السياسي والاستعماري وتأنيث الفقر والحوكمة المالية الدولية وأثر العولمة على الهجرة العمالية. شاركوني بالترحيب بالأستاذة بيكو، تفضلي الكلمة معك.
Thank you so much, Chairperson. My name is Lebohang Pheko, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I am deeply honored by this invitation. I'm deeply honored to be sharing in this celebration with SADAQA. 10 years is a whole decade. 10 years is not something that comes easily. It comes with sweat, it comes with blood, it comes with much sacrifice, it comes with selflessness. And I think that in the light of everything that we have been going through over the last year and in previous years, I am so honored to be part of this celebration, and I congratulate you completely and sincerely on behalf of myself and many in my community who are also tuning in. And I thank you, the organizers, for this invitation. I also, all protocols are observed, to all the dignitaries, the women and men who fight, the struggles, the activists, the mothers, the sisters, the aunties, the grandmothers, the ones who were, the ones who have been, and the ones who are, who struggle, who strive. I honor each one of you. I also call on the Creator, the one who is, who was, and who is to come, to lift us, to energize us, to motivate us, to inspire us. I call on the energies and the inspiration of the many warriors who have come before, the women warriors who have come before, and the ones who are with us now. And I want to mention, because I think it's very important to evoke these names and to evoke these memories and to evoke these energies. I call on Nzinga, and I mention Amina, I mention Emila Bisharat, I mention May Musa Sayekh, I mention Latifa Al-Zayat, I mention Sojourner Truth, I mention Harriet Tubman, I mention Josina Machel, Wangari Maathai, Toni Morrison, Buchi Emecheta, Zondeni Sobukwe, Loretta Ngobo, Ransom Kuti, Mabel Dove, Ushadi Mangena, and many others. And I mention each of you, and I honor each one of us. I want to start my remarks by foregrounding the work that SADAQA has been doing, especially in relation to Article 72, Article 42, and the gender transportation of labor law, among many other remarkable achievements and remarkable spearheaded efforts that they have been embarking on. And we had the opportunity to have a very rich discussion before this meeting last week. And I think that it's important for me to pick up my remarks exactly from this standpoint. So I'm going to take us through a discussion on the intersectionality of what care actually is, offer some definitional provocations, offer a definitional reaction to what the state needs to be doing in order to enable us to be recognized as workers, and make a few suggestions about what work actually is and what it does and has not meant over the last few years, especially using definitional contradictions, using, of course, the frames of feminism, sociology, and just political science, and our lived experience, which is basically what African feminism and third world feminisms draw on, is really the binaries that draw on ourselves as part of the contributors to the knowledge repository. So I'd like to start by saying that self-recognition and knowledge and reclamation are at the heart of how we might methodologically approach intersectionality. And this is really where care, as it has been characterized, is paramount and it is important. In this contemporary moment, we seem to have lost the ability to take time out, to think, to write, to draw, to imagine, to wonder, and to let our curiosity dictate what our lives should be. And in all of this, we have lost the time to care for ourselves. Oftentimes, the question and the notion of care is externalized as one that belongs to other people, but never belongs to we as the people who care. And more, we are propelled into a system that requires all of our labor to produce at breakneck speed, suggesting that somehow this survival of the fittest model of labor capitalism is achieved with a lack of all human needs. So it's as though we are not entitled to food, we're not entitled to sleep, we're not entitled to air, we're not even entitled to love, we're not entitled to shelter, and even for the luxury of pausing for thought. So this late capitalist model has alienated the human body to such a degree that we are no longer allowed to be human in order to be considered successful. Bell Hooks actually calls for childcare outside the home, and this seemingly simple concept is envisaged by the women's movement of accessible, reliable, quality daycare, and has proved largely elusive, which is why we celebrate the Jordanian model so highly and so loudly. And while private, often overpriced sources of daycare have risen to meet middle-class needs, Montessori and so on, the inadequacy of this remains an absolute outrage. The inadequacy of public affordable daycare remains an absolute outrage across the world. And the Children's Defense Fund, for example, was a child advocacy group in Washington, D.C. that reports that 6 to 7 million children in a supposedly first world country, which is a problematic construct in and of itself, including preschoolers, may be left at home alone while their parents work because they cannot afford daycare. So many daycare centers cater either to the needs of the working classes or the bourgeoisie, those who are able to exist, and they are not non-sexist. So the work that SADAQA has been doing and continues to do is not just a nice to have, it is actually a necessarily revolutionary move, and it meets the intersection of class, of wage, and of gender binaries that are the exclusionary factors to finding what care means. Now, there's evidently a care gap in many countries. And I think I use the word care with caution because it means so many things. And I think by way of prefacing my remarks, I want to add that I use the word care for conceptual clarity, but I have many personal wrestlings with care as a construct because I suggest that it actually minimizes and sometimes diminishes the work that women do. I also suggest that the binary between care that is conducted within the home and the care that is conducted outside the home might actually be a false binary. The work of teaching, the work of nursing, the work of social work, and especially the professions which reproduce a care ethic. And I would want to suggest that for the purposes of this discussion, that I am wrestling with the languaging of this myself, bearing in mind that English is my 5th language as well. But the care responsibilities are having negative impacts on mothers and other carers. And again, the notion that mothering and caring are synonymous. So what we also need to think about is that the lack of care is damaging not only where women are pushed to the limit, as I said, where we don't have the time to think, to draw, to wonder, but also that it is a time-consuming, resource-intensive, and capital-intensive activity, which is not recognized or appropriately remunerated or even named by the GDP, named in national systems of accounting, and named as productive work. It may come as no surprise that scholars like Nancy Falboy remind us that breastfeeding is considered to be a work of leisure. It may not come as no surprise that changing a diaper, going shopping, doing homework with children are all counted as leisure work. And as we sit, many of us with our children of various hair colors, various ages, and various needs, we will be very sure that there is nothing leisurely about what we are doing. Now, the economic concept of work has not been met by the policy commitments, the national strategies, the legal reforms, and the numerous initiatives and projects that don't really make significant impact on the indicators relating to women's labor force participation. And when I say labor force, I include the labor that is unremunerated, and I include the labor that is counted as care work. I also mention here that there are disparities in women's economic participation between urban and rural women, education levels, marital status, and these also remain unaddressed. I'm aware that in countries like Jordan, that there's a high attrition rate for married women from the workforce. And successful interventions remain so sporadic and also almost seem like mere lip service. You know, we're gender mainstreaming, we are gender budgeting, we are allocating, and yet these do not speak to the systematic and structural power relations, the ways in which states have been constructed in ways that they actually use women as women of last resource, using women, the work that women do as an insurance policy against state neglect and the vacancies of the state in relation to benefits, in relation to social security, and in relation to the conversations, the difficult conversations about appropriate enumeration and recognition for this work. And I want to then move to the notion of the economic concept of work. What are we actually talking about? Now, the concept of work, of course, was formulated within the Fordist construct of industrial processes. So this notion that a man would go to work, go to a factory, enter into a hierarchical or boss bondservant or boss laborer relationship, boss factory worker relationship with their employee. One that suggested that work could only be validated if it was done on the premises. Of course, this has since been completely turned on its head over the last few years. This also suggested that it was that only wage salary was valid as work. But in all of this, of course, this collusion between patriarchy and capitalism meant that while the man was off going and doing the real work of earning an income, it was suggested then that, of course, women were the ones who were left to stay home, not work, and look after the household. By the 1900s, this had been formally relegated to the census. Women had been actually relegated to the category of dependents, a category that also included infants, young children, the sick, and the elderly, the very people who we were caring for. We were also considered as dependents in the same breath. Quite bizarre. And it's also interesting to note that, of course, the definition of work must, of course, shift as social norms, industrial norms, as cultural norms and languaging and social linguistics also shift. Remember that it's only 150 years that in some parts of the world, particularly in parts of the US, the Caribbean, where slave colonies were seen as socially acceptable and part of the economic extractivist model of capitalism, it was seen as perfectly acceptable for Black and brown bodies to be transported across the world to do the work and to build industries and to build empires on behalf of settler nations. Of course, 150 years later, that model of deep, crude extractivism is seen, at least on the face of it, as extremely putrid, morally reprehensible, and yet, industrialized capitalism in many ways continues to rely on a version of that very extractivist form of labor. And in leading industrial economies by the second half of the 19th century, economic and ideological struggles over these roles resulted in the norm by which only men took paid employment if their households could afford it. And women's activities, in inverted commas, included the necessary running of the households, providing no grounds by which they could be measured against this work that men or other women did in the paid economy. It also creates this false binary between the market economy and the social economy, and forgets completely that, of course, for one to function, the other must be present. So for a person to be able to go out into the worker marketplace, there must be another mechanism to keep the domestic side of life ticking, humming, protected. Children must be cared for, elderly relatives must be cared for, people who are sick must be cared for. And again, this is all to do with the deficit of states which have completely neglected or relegated their responsibilities, outsourced their responsibilities to unpaid women's labor, or the labor that women do. The problematic of this, of course, is that it also has continued to feed into gendered, sexist, stereotypical, parochial views of what women's work is and what men's work is. And I think it's quite useful for us to be careful in our phrasing and of this as characterizing this as women's work, because of course it assumes that it is inherent. It assumes that indeed this is our role and that there is none other than this one. It also then does nothing to then deal with deconstructing the sexist ideologies which have led to these systems of assuming that it's only women's work. I mean, and that women are somehow inherently more caring, inherently better at cooking, inherently more likely to feed the children. And then, of course, after decades and decades and centuries of socialization, you rise to the occasion. You do it because you must. But I don't suspect that you do it because you are inherently better at it. As they say, practice makes perfect, but it also makes exhausted. There's also an increasing recognition during the COVID-19 pandemic that has exposed and entrenched racial, gender, and class inequalities that have long been neglected across the globe. If there's a lemonade that we can draw and sip from this lemon of a year that we have had, this lemon of a situation that we are in, it is that the intersecting effects of power and identities affect women's paid and unpaid and underpaid labor, particularly the role that we've played in providing both paid and unpaid care. This includes that the labor that women perform in the home, in the health and the social care sectors, the women's role in the precarious work, including domestic work, including, of course, work that is characterized as informal. So the work that is not perhaps subject to GNP indices, and that is not perhaps subject to taxes, and that is not registered, but is nonetheless formal work in as much as it is consistent and it is regularly undertaken. Given that we come from regions where the 9 to 5, the rational man who goes to work from 9 to 5 is actually a minority, where unemployment rates are extremely high. South Africa's unemployment rate is about 40%, and that is on average, actually better than average across many African countries, where it goes up to 60 or 75% of people who are characterized as being in formal work. This definitional clarity becomes quite important, because just because people are not working 9 to 5 doesn't mean that they are not earning a livelihood and sustaining themselves in some way. This is particularly profound, especially because many countries do not have social protection or a dole or a social welfare or benefit system that one would see, particularly in the global north. Now, the evidence of care labor that women carry is unequivocal. Globally, women are responsible for the majority of unpaid social reproduction, 76.2%. And we spend an average of 201 days on unpaid work during a year. That's a lot of time. You can write a book in 200 days. You can finish a thesis in 200 days. You can train for a marathon. You can climb mountains. You can write poems in 200 days, compared to 63 days spent on unpaid work by men. The ILO also reports that 136 million workers in the health and social care sectors, 70% are women, and around 80% of the world's domestic workers are women. Migrant domestic workers in particular face additional challenges due to their often illegal, precarious legal status and limited labor rights. And remember, I ask us to draw on the notion that care work is not only what happens within my own home, it might be the care that I give to other other people in their homes, in hospitals, and so forth. This is a very important binary, particularly at a time where biocolonialism, pharma imperialism are also creating a hierarchy of whose lives are of value. So the stereotypical caricature now of the COVID heroes is of white male, predominantly white male doctors moving through the wards heroically with super S's on their chests, saving the world, with nothing said about the Black and brown women across the world who are working as auxiliary health workers, as cleaners, who are making the beds, who are cleaning the equipment, who are cleaning the hospitals, who are ensuring that there is a sterile environment for this, a sterile and a hygienic environment for this. They are just as worthy as the rounds of applause and the banging at 7 p.m. every evening, but they are not in the popular imagination and they're not part of the narrative. I think many of us would have seen that just a few weeks ago, several doctors and nurses at the NHS signed a petition to say that they were not willing to take the COVID vaccine until there was a guarantee that non-documented or migrant health workers would also have access to this vaccine, to the vaccination, in recognition that their work is of equal value, but that their lives are equally important. So women's labor has also, or the work that women do, of course, has also been characterized as a specific gendered practice. And of course, this is based on gender norms, and it manifests in this asymmetrical distribution of paid and unpaid work between women and men that I've mentioned, 200 days versus 63 days, and care work as an economic power and necessary to reproduce labor must therefore be understood as part of the overall capitalist system of extractive reproduction. It's also understood as a moral value and an ethic for the development of what we would call a good society and a fair economy, according to feminist economics conception. And within this context, care constitutes the condition humana that is characterized by mutual dependency, mutual need, and relationality. And the ethic of relationality is extremely important to the ethic of feminist economics. And it's also conceptualized through features like autonomy and dependency, time consumption, often bonded to location, resources, and essential to maintain different forms of livelihood. And the idea of homo economicus, the rational independent person, usually the rational white man, is at the center of the feminist economics critique. And this has become the stereotype of how white male citizens have become the feature, the default of the person who's viewed as a worker. I mean, this is a construction which is 150 years old. It's bizarre that it is still the one which we feel is most appropriate to describe us. And yet there's been very little movement forward. It also suggests, of course, that we need to go beyond. Feminist economics suggests that we need to go beyond traditional economic thought, and we need to really think around the assessment of care. We need to think around this care diamond, which was developed sometime within the UNRISD project, and as the architecture through which care is provided in capitalist economies as well as in countries of the global South. Now, the radical reconceptualization of the economy, feminist economics, with whom I align myself, have really proposed a radical reconceptualization of the economy that puts human and ecological needs and well-being at the center against their analysis of the so-called care economy or the social economy. Julia Nelson defines the economy thereafter as the human activity of provisioning. And that's provisioning in all spheres, in and outside the home. And Marilyn Powell suggests that this would entail reconceptualizing economics at the study of provisioning. And this is not an issue that is limited to countries of the global South, to Black and brown people, to the Arab world, the African world, the Asian world, or the Latin American world. As part of a recent COVID-19 related legislation, the US government recently committed to providing a quasi-universal child benefit, an affluence-tested UCB, a monthly child cash benefit, where, like in Iceland, only the very wealthiest families will not receive the full amount. It is likely to have some impact far beyond the family budget, but of course, like many issues, there are already many who are falling outside the cracks. Now, reflections under this COVID-19 cloud. I'd like to say that across the globe, alongside disease, death, economic dislocation, COVID-19 has also brought cause for reflection on the value of social protection, on the existing provisions for children. And again, the US is no exception. And this notion that there has to be we have to think about the left behind. We always have to think about the ones falling outside the net. And those children who, without any means of redress, are actually excluded from vital parts of social contracts. Now, sustaining benefit across generations also mattered. So potentially these UCBs might play a crucial role as welfare linchpins and enhance cash value and so forth. But for children everywhere, toward global standards in social protection for children, we have to think about a model that is intergenerational, that does not punish, that does not poverty shame, and that does not punish those who, for whatever reason, which is probably the majority of us, have been failed by extractive capitalism. Most troublingly, though, this model actually has effectively allowed the most vulnerable children in society to pay the price for their parents' employment status and earnings and the structural challenges that families face. And in so doing, it's overlooked the two basic principles of social protection. And the one is that over the course of their lives, everyone contributes to society through taxes, labor, and care. And secondly, that children benefits are for children who have a fundamental and inherent human right to social security. So oftentimes, of course, in many instances, we are told that this is for taxpayers. Everybody pays tax. We pay human tax, we pay time tax, we pay taxes with our health. Everybody pays a financial or a non-financial tax of some kind. And if most countries, of course, have a VAT at the point of sale, everybody is paying some kind of a tax. So this notion of tax shaming and poverty shaming and class delineation for who should and should not access basic benefits is something that I think the feminist critique has a very important voice on. I think I'd like to say something as well around the changing definitions of work. And just to add to here that in this changing definition, what are the adequate levels of social insurance? So I've spoken about the notion of some man going to work and going off in the morning like Fred Flintstone with his lunch that his wife Wilma made for him, and so on and so forth, and that this is what work looks like. And of course, this is hopelessly outdated. But what we do need to think about, I would suggest, is that what does work mean in a time of COVID and Corona and beyond, where the workspace and the home space are often concurrent, where unpaid care work and paid care work, again, are often concurrent. And what the coronavirus has done, again, some of the lemonade, is to bring these convergences into sharp analytical framing. Again, I'd like to mention here that in terms of what broadly is defined as work, it involves looking at after the physical, the social, the psychological, the emotional, the developmental needs of different people. And it's a very ambiguous, slippery, nebulous notion. It stretches from physical care, which to some extent may be even independent of a relationship between the carer and the person who is cared for. It might be emotional caring, in which case the person doing the caring is inseparable from the caregiving, but the concept of caring labor describes the kind of work that requires personal attention, services that are not only provided on a face-to-face or at least a first name basis, and the lack of recognition for this form of work as it is perceived. It requires competence and skill and learning to be done well. And it also takes time and effort. It involves stress due to fear of failing, and it involves great emotional and physical strain. And to call this leisure is deeply disrespectful, to say the very least. Other research also suggests that the women's increased care burden urges equitable distribution of tasks between women and men. But a feminist economist, which I'm not opposed to, but I also feel that that is too dependent on relationality, and we also appreciate that power relations and power dynamics within households can be extremely complicated, that there are access issues, access to voice, access to power, access to decision-making, access to time that play themselves out even within the domestic sphere, meaning that a man and a woman may be having two completely different life experiences, even of poverty, even of time within the same household. And we cannot, again, underestimate the violence of patriarchy, the violence of machismo, and the violence of intergenerational, intersectional expectations of roles and responsibilities that have been allocated between women and men. I'd also like to then move on to just to say something about the COVID-19 fault lines that have been revealed around neoliberal, gendered, and racialized policies, some of which I've alluded to in relating to the hierarchical and or the problematic top-down approach that some of that health workers are experiencing, and the very important solidarity that the British healthcare workers showed with Black and brown, non-white, their non-white colleagues. But it's also worth mentioning here that there are inequalities evidenced even within the health and social care systems. And I'd like to also mention here that they are indeed, it's important to ensure that as we go and look at a world beyond COVID, and I don't know if there is a world beyond COVID or a world beyond masks or what that looks like, but what are the perspectives and the policy dynamics and the structural shifts that we need to make right now? The blind spotting has been done by feminist economics, and how does that translate into rethinking social reproduction and translating that into policy? I'd like to then conclude here by saying that the collusion and the love affair between patriarchy and capitalism, of course, is responsible for all of this. It's responsible for the gendered systems of exchange. It's responsible for the gendered internationalized divisions of labor and extractive forms of labor. It is responsible for the effects of monetary exchange in fashioning, challenging, and transforming feminist economic relations. It's also responsible to a very great extent for the ways in which changing relations between nation states and the global economy, the very same nation states that treat women as the women of last resort rather than enabling a social provisioning. And this is often at the expense, of course, of globalized capital accumulation and investment in companies and corporates, but not investment in humanity. And I want to then conclude by saying, in fact, that if you bring the question of fundamental rights into family, and if every individual in the family is treated as a fair and equal citizen, it is very conceivable, my sisters, that the family could collapse. It could be a revolutionary act, because the family exists as a clearly established power base of gender triumphing age, that is an adult male who's often more powerful than even an elder female, where a woman might be the dependent of her own son. Thus, the leisure is hardly an entity of women within the institution of the family. So as a matter of fact, every woman who breathes can be considered as a working woman. As we sleep, we think of the morning, and in the morning, we think of the day, and as we eat, we think of the next meal and where we need to be, and of traffic. And I want to evoke the words of another wonderful departed warrior woman, Maya Angelou, and this poem where she says, I've got children to tend, I've got the clothes to mend, I've got the floor to mop, I've got the food to shop, then the chicken to fry, the baby to dry. I've got the company to feed, the garden to weed, I've got the shirts to press and the tots to dress, the can to be cut, I've got to clean up this hut, then see about the sick, and the cotton to pick. Shine on me, sunshine, rain on me, rain, fall softly, dewdrops, and cool my brow again. Storm, blow me from here with your fiercest wind. Let me float across the sky till I can rest again. Fall gently, snowflakes, cover me with white, cold, icy kisses, and just let me rest tonight. Rain, sun, curving sky, mountains, oceans, leaf and stone, star, shine, moon, glow. You are all that I can call my own. I thank you.